Listeners, I've got a special treat for you. It's a book reading by Richard S. J. Morgan. Yes, the name sounds familiar, because that's my husband. I'm going to be reading from his published novel, yes, he's a writer too, called Naria. Discover the wonders to be held in the misty mountains as Naria mourns her missing husband, Kalsh, and encounters the strange guardian, Seger. Adventures and mysteries abound in this tale of one woman's quest to protect the baby prince from the dark forces at the helm of the wizard, Ashka. Naria was a goddess in Celtic mythology who appears to have been venerated only in what is now the western part of Switzerland. Her nature and responsibilities remain somewhat obscure. She is mentioned only twice in known inscriptions from the Gallo-Roman era, on a stone altar and on the base of a statuette. It shows her in a long-sleeved dress and with a diadem in her hair. The hands which held her divine attributes are missing. This depiction of Naria follows a generic style then used in Italy, mostly for depictions of the goddess of luck, Fortuna. This indicates that Naria might have also been conceived of as a goddess of good luck and blessings. Chapter 1. She stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly along the rocky shore, her head lowered as if in prayer. She picked her way amongst the sharp rocks, and every few feet Naria would stop and cast her gaze seaward and then lift her head to the stars. She was indeed praying and asking the gods for a miracle. It had been almost 9 cycles of the moon since he had left for sea, and it was not unusual for the men to be gone for weeks, and sometimes for months, depending on the fishing. But the others had returned, and Naria's husband was still out there somewhere, she hoped. She prayed that the gods that ruled the sea and the sky would grant her a miracle. Without her companion, Naria's life was becoming unbearable. The days were growing longer and more lonesome, while the nights were much, much colder. Evenings that were once filled with gentle laughter were heavy with sadness and a growing despair. Naria's interactions with most of the other villagers were becoming strained, and her few relationships and friendships became more frayed as the days passed. Many of the other women, aware of her misfortune, had begun to shun her. You see, to the other women, Naria was without a man, and no man-child to help her. To them, that meant her eyes would start to wander in the direction of their own men, and she would in turn attract their gaze as well. Not only was she missing her husband, but Naria's present predicament was further compounded by the fact that she was not from these parts, and many still considered her an outsider and treated her with mistrust. Naria came there with her husband soon after they were married. For much of her time in this village, she had struggled against the stigma of being the outsider, a wanderer, beholden to the ways of the Nagosh, a nomadic race from the inner highlands. But among other things, Naria was a survivor, washed ashore after the unfortunate ship that carried her family was dashed against the rocks not far from the shores on which she now wandered. As a young child, her daily existence was filled with ridicule and physical abuse. As a young adult, her imposing height, piercing green eyes, and fiery red hair was more of a hindrance than a help in making friends. Her fierce pride and temper was no help either. While most men would gaze at her stunning beauty from afar with lust and longing, they were less than forthcoming in her presence. The women, on the other hand, found reasons to distrust her, since no one woman should possess such radiance. Despite all of that, she had found love, and now that too had been taken from her. With a heavy sigh, Naria's gaze left the sky and she continued on her vigil. Her keen sense of smell caught the scent of blood and something else on the sea breeze that was unfamiliar to her. She reacted to the change in the air like a deer sensing a predator. The scent of blood quickened her steps, and she turned and headed for home. The full moon broke from the cover of clouds, and the silver moonlight frolicked and danced across the surface of the sea. And something in the dancing moonlight caught Naria's eye. At the water's edge, something, a box, or maybe a chest of some sort. Naria wasn't sure, but her curiosity got the better of her, and the uneasiness caused by the scent of blood receded momentarily. She quickly changed direction and headed towards the water's edge. She moved quickly, for the sea is fickle, and wayward tides will quickly change direction and drag whatever it catches back out to sea. Naria's long strides cut into the distance between her and the object at the water's edge. As she got closer, other objects began to enter her field of vision, but those did not matter. She was somehow drawn to the object at the water's edge alone. The unfamiliar smell grew stronger now, but was not a concern. She could feel a strange inner excitement building inside her belly. What could that be? She murmured to herself, barely above a whisper. And as she got close enough to see over the sides and into the box, something in the box moved. She thought her imagination was getting the better of her. Maybe it was a trick of the sea or the flicker of moonlight. In a flash, Naria closed the remaining distance between her and the object. She was standing over the box now. She glanced about her and noticed that there was more debris coming ashore with each swell of the tide. Naria looked with both horror and fascination as the remnants of a shipwreck obviously came tumbling ashore. A gurgling sound snapped her attention back to the box. The box was, in fact, not a box nor a chest, but a cradle covered in intricate carvings. Amidst these intricate and beautiful carvings of amazing design, there was an inscription, something written in Elvish. It was heavily lined on the inside to protect whatever precious cargo it was carrying. The bottom of the box was rounded, which would allow it to rock from side to side like a pendulum. Naria quickly glanced around her. The bundle in the box gurgled again. Her heart was now pounding loudly in her head. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. Her uneasiness was now replaced by a mixture of excitement and terror. Naria reached down and grabbed the cradle in order to pull it away from the sea's grasp. The small craft was as sturdy as it looked, and yet uncommonly light. Her pulling motions caused more gurgling to come from the box. Naria looked around again to make sure she was alone, and she was, for the moment. Naria reached in and gingerly pulled back the silky material, and to her amazement and utter astonishment, her uncovering revealed a babbling and chubby baby. The baby was holding in its tiny hand what seemed to be a toy. In between gurgles, the baby would shove it in his mouth and proceed with a sucking and chewing activity, completely oblivious to what was going on. The baby suddenly saw the presence of Naria and looked up with green eyes. The baby, seeing the unfamiliar face, frowned and is then moments away from crying. Naria stooped down beside the chest and then reached in and stroked the baby's face while cooing softly. Naria's soft voice soothes the baby, and he goes back to chewing on his toy. Naria looks around again and up and down the water's edge to make sure she is alone. She then stands up and, lifting the cradle with ease, whispers, "This is no place for you, little one," more to herself than to the baby. She turned swiftly and quickly retraced her steps as she headed back for home. Chapter 2. Naria saw the light of the lamp flickering in the window of her home. Naria always left a lamp or a candle burning when she went out at night. Somewhere in her past, she had learned to leave a light burning to guide the way home. With the cradle growing heavy in her arms, Naria glanced quickly over her shoulder to check her tracks. She saw a slight movement in the shadows a few yards away. A small animal or a branch, maybe. Nothing to worry about, she tells herself. Just at the same time, she shifts the cradle and feels for the silver dagger she keeps hidden within the folds of her skirt. Quickly, and after one more backward glance, Naria makes straight for the door to her modest home. The woman slips the latch of the door open and moves inside without making a sound and quickly closes the door, fastening it against the night. With her back against the door, Naria peers into the cradle as if to ensure that her eyes were not deceiving her. And yes, the baby was still there, clutching his toy. Naria carried the cradle to the large room and set it down by the warmth of the fire, and she then sat on a low stool beside the cradle and looked intently at the baby. Finally, the rush of her adrenaline begins to subside. The shaking in her legs and hands was starting to fade away now. "What is the meaning of this?" she whispers to the crackling of the fire. Naria gently reaches into the cradle and lifts the bundle into her lap. The steady green eyes stare into hers, and the baby smiled, somewhat knowingly. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, too, and suddenly she finds herself breaking into a toothy grin. "You must be hungry. How long were you out there, little one?" she asks. While cradling the baby in her lap, Naria reaches with her other hand into the cradle and feels around instinctively. "There must be something here that will give us a clue about you, right, my little one?" Then her hand bumps against a solid object and she pulls back slightly. "What's this?" She reaches further into the remaining material and pulls out a jeweled medallion. The inscriptions on it were similar to the markings on the cradle. The largest of the gemstones was centered in the very middle of the medallion, and it caught the light of the fire. To Naria's eyes, the light of the fire caught in the jewel appears to dance, momentarily, to a pulsing rhythm. For but a moment, the medallion holds Naria's attention, but not for too long. The baby lying in the crook of her arm begins to fuss. So Naria quickly places the medallion on the wooden floor next to the cradle and turns her attention back to the baby. She gently puts the baby back into the cradle, cooing while she does so. "I must find something for you to eat." She walks quickly to a smaller room off of the back of the house, cordoned off by a beaded curtain. Naria returns with a wooden tray, carrying an earthen bowl partly filled with leftover broth, a bit of cheese, and a small crust of bread. She sat down with the tray across her knees and crushes the bread and cheese into the broth, forming a thick, mealy substance. She lifts the baby back to her lap and begins the messy process of spoon feeding the baby in small, manageable mouthfuls. Feeding the infant was messy. However, Naria took delight in watching the baby grab, gurgle, and slurp as he ate. She then cleaned up the baby as best as she could and put him back in his cradle. It was getting late, and soon the moon would be high in the sky, and before you knew it, the morning sun would be coming over the mountains. After eating, the baby quickly fell asleep without much complaint. Naria stood over him and watched the slow rising and falling of his chest as he breathed softly. She, too, felt the call of sleep and yawned quietly. And then her gaze turned to the fire, and she remembered Kalsh's laughter. In the early days of her marriage, Naria and Kalsh would spend their evenings around this very fire, discussing the earlier events of their day and planning for their future together. Having children was one of the first things they wanted to do after their wedding. He would often remark, "Raising a family along these quiet shores is nothing more that a man can ask for. He would then puff on his pipe and gaze off, lost in the flickering of the fire. The thoughts of her Kalsh caused her sadness to return, and then the tears came. Rushing like a river, she began to weep and dropped to her knees. The pain she feels seemed unbearable, and as she clutched her stomach and shook, the emotions and tears make their way from the depths of her soul. Kalsh was not coming back. No matter how many walks along the shore she takes and how many prayers to the gods, Kalsh's days have ended. He is dead, and she accepts that now. Naria weeps. Chapter 3. In her pain, Naria lay by the fire in the fetal position, legs drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around her stomach as if to hold on to the pain she was feeling in the knowledge that her life with Kalsh is no more. She lay in that position for a long time, and in her grief she did not notice the figure standing in the shadows by the window. The figure watched intently and in silence the entire event of Naria's soul rendering release. Eventually, Naria's sobbing subsides, and the cold hardness of the floor begins to seep through the fabric of her clothes. Naria straightens her legs and pushes herself up into a sitting position. She looks into the cradle. The baby is still there, breathing softly. He sleeps, unaware of Naria's emotional breakdown. Naria gets up from the floor. The floor is no place to spend the night when there is a bed, she says to herself, and she then turns slowly to head for the only private quarters in the house. As she stands and turns, Naria sees a slight movement in the shadows by the window. In a flash, her silver dagger is in her grasp. With a mixture of fear and anger, Naria snarls, "Who are you, and what do you want in my house?" The shadowy figure moved slightly in the direction of the cradle. Naria moved to block. "Take another step, and I'll gut you where you stand." Sensing a threat to the child, there was more anger than fear burning within Naria now. Her hand holding the dagger was no longer shaking, and narrowing her eyes, she crouched like a wild cat into a knife fighter's stance. Naria had not always been a fisherman's wife. She knew a bit about wielding a blade within close quarters, something else she had picked up along her many travels. The figure slowly raised both hands, palms up and open. "I mean you no harm," the figure said in a deep, quiet voice. "Who are you and what do you want?" Naria snarled again. "I am the guardian." "Guardian of what?" Naria cut him off, still holding her position and watching carefully for any sudden movements. "I am guardian to the prince," he gestured with his head, bowing slightly in the direction of the cradle behind Naria. The bowing gesture revealed an image tattooed on the hairless dome of his head. Naria caught sight of the tattoo by the light of the fire. The tattoo was an exact replica of the design she had seen on the medallion inside of the cradle earlier. "Move into the light and keep your hands where I can see them," Naria directed him with the blade of the dagger. "Sit on the chair," Naria commanded with her steady voice. The dagger never wavered from its position between them. The tall man moved with the grace of a large cat. His eyes never left those of Naria's. He draped his large frame across the chair. He wore a black cloak that seemed to absorb all the light around him. He placed his hands on the table, palms down and fingers spread apart. The baby stirred in his sleep, causing the figure on the chair to stiffen ever so slightly. His eyes darted in the direction of the cradle. "Don't move," Naria hissed at him, lowering her voice. She reached back with her left leg and gently nudged the cradle into a rocking motion. and the baby's breathing resumed its smooth rhythm. "I mean you no harm," the guardian said again, speaking more softly. His eyes softened in the light of the flickering lamp. The shadowy figure lowered his head in a submissive manner. Naria again caught the sight of the tattoo on the crown of his shaven head. The image is now burning into her mind. "What's that on your head?" she asks. "It's a sign of my covenant with the royal family," he answers, touching the reflective crown of his head. "My people have been guardian to the royal family for many generations, and my duty is to protect the prince at all cost, including death." With the sound of the word death, the strange scent that had earlier caught Naria's senses by the shore now suddenly filled the room. Naria glanced around without moving from her guarded position. She looked even closer at her uninvited guest and saw that he was bleeding. By the looks of things, he had been bleeding for a lot longer than he was letting on. Chapter 4. "You are wounded. How bad is it?" Naria asks this while lowering her blade only slightly and stepping hesitantly towards the seated intruder. "It is not as bad as you think. My only concern is for the prince. He must be kept safe." A look of concern clouded his eyes. "As you can see, the baby is doing fine. I've fed him and he is now sleeping," Naria answered. "Thanks be to the gods," he sighed. "You are bleeding." She pointed to the leg of his trousers. "Yes, please, I need to tend my wounds." He looked up pleadingly. "Can I trust you?" Naria responded. "Allow me to do what I can to earn your trust." Then he slowly removed his outer cape, which revealed a harness of weapons. Naria's back stiffened at the sight of them. "Please, I will disarm myself as long as the prince is safe. I am at your mercy." He lowered his head again, submissively. "Fine, but remember, any trickery and I will gut you like a fish," she replied. The guardian slowly piled his effects in a bundle by the foot of the chair, and he then nudged the bundle in Naria's direction with his extended leg. The blade in Naria's fist quickly disappeared within the folds of her skirt. With the toe of her boot, Naria pushed the bundle further out of the reach of the figure sitting across from her. "What do you need to tend to your wounds?" Naria asked. "Most of what I need is right here." He then pulled a small pouch from his belt. He poured a pungent-smelling powder into his open palm and then added a bit of water from the pitcher sitting on the table. With his index finger, he formed the pasty mixture, which thickened rather quickly. The mixture set into a thick paste, and the guardian grunted as he shifted his shirt to show a couple of deep gashes on his torso. With some difficulty, he applied the paste to the open wounds. Naria watched him from across the room, waiting for him to fall off the chair. From where she stood, she could see the severity of the wounds and wondered to herself, how could any man survive such wounds? But then, this appeared to be no ordinary man. The guardian finished applying the mixture to his open wounds, which seemed to stem the previously ample blood flow. He tilted his head back to catch his breath. His face was ashen, and beads of sweat had gathered upon his brow. He lowered his head and looked in Naria's direction. Naria watched him as his eyes swiftly rolled back into his head, and then the guardian let out a low groan and slid from the chair and landed upon the stone floor with a thud. The crumpled figure on the floor made one final twitch and then laid still. Naria looked down again at the cradle at her feet to make sure the infant was still lost in sleep, and then she silently slid across the room to stand over the wounded heap of this strange man. He was still breathing. Naria could hear the rasping of each breath as the guardian labored to exchange the air he needed to continue living. She then bent over the body and touched his still damp forehead. It was clammy with sweat, but he was also running a fever now. That wasn't good. She had seen men die in the night from lesser wounds. The infections that killed them always started with a fever. She moved quickly and in silence so as not to wake the sleeping baby. All she would need now is a fussing infant to deal with. Naria did her best to position the fallen man into a comfortable lying position. She placed a makeshift pillow made of a bundle of cloth below his head, and this seemed to help with his breathing. The thought occurred to her to move him to the only bed in the house. And then that thought was quickly dashed, since even if she really wanted to move him, with all of her strength, she knew that she could not move him alone. Furthermore, wounded or not, Naria was still wary of her uninvited guest. She made him as comfortable as she could by covering him also with a blanket. During all of this, the uninvited guest, now patient, did not move. His breathing became steady now. Maybe her efforts were of some help. Having done all she could, Naria stood back and surveyed her slumbering guest. She then took the pitcher from the table and placed it within easy reach of the sleeping figure. She made her way back to the hearth and the sleeping baby. She placed a few more pieces of wood on the fire to ensure it would burn through the night. Naria then gently picked up the cradle and with a quick and sideward glance headed to the one private area in the house. She placed the cradle onto the bed and laid down beside it. She was exhausted. The plethora of events that had occurred that evening caught up to her rather quickly, and before she knew it, she was sound asleep. Visions filled her nocturnal domain. Images of light and color wrapped themselves around the fragments of her mind. Naria's dreams were occupied with faraway places and future events of magic and wonder. These dreams, however, were also tinged with an impending sense of fright. Chapter 5. The occupants of the one-bedroom house, located in a small fishing village nestled amidst the shadows of the misty mountains, slept. The dawn eventually crept across the valley, and the sun climbed up and over the mountains and chased the dewdrops away. Naria sat upright in bed with a start, the memories of yesterday flooding back into her mind. She tossed her feet over the side of the bed and quickly stood up. Her sudden movement rocked the cradle, but her movements did little to disturb the still sleeping baby. The sight again of the sleeping infant confirmed the validity of the thoughts still rushing through Naria's head from the night before. She quickly slipped across the floor and gently opened the door a crack. She listened intently, but there was no sound coming from the other parts of the house. Naria slowly opened the door wider and stuck her head out into the larger room. The remainder of the house was empty, and everything was in order. The chairs were upright and placed orderly about the table. Naria was prepared to see the body of her other guest lying where he had fallen, worse for wear, if not indeed dead. The blanket that had covered him the night before was folded neatly on a nearby bench. There was no trace of her uninvited house guest, except for the fact that the fire was still going and something was simmering in the open pot. The tangy aroma of cooking fish filled her nostrils, which caused her stomach to rumble. Naria was hungry. She stepped gingerly into the larger room and pulled the door closed behind her. Her initial fears were quickly being replaced by pangs of hunger. The guardian was true to his word in that he meant her nor the babe no harm. If he did, he could have easily slit her throat while she slept, or at least attempted to. Naria made her way towards the fire, guided by the smell of cooking and directly propelled by the rumblings in her stomach. She bent over the open pot hanging in the hearth. Chunks of fish and bits of herbs were rolling about in a warm and thick broth. Naria was tempted to help herself to the food, but other bodily functions suddenly announced themselves. She quickly made her way outdoors to relieve herself. Some things just cannot wait, one of which is your bladder first thing in the morning. After Naria went about the business of attending to her bodily functions with expediency, she tidied herself and headed back indoors. With the comfort of knowing that her bladder was relieved, she could now pay full attention to her growling stomach. Naria opened the door to find the guardian bent over the open pot, stirring its contents in a slow and deliberate manner. His sudden presence brought back a bit of the uneasiness and fear she'd had the night before. But that was quickly put aside by the fact that he had his back to her, or maybe it was the fact that he was cooking. "You are awake. Good. I have made breakfast. I hope that it pleases you," he said, without turning away from the fire. She entered the room and stood there, uncertain of her next move. The figure crouching by the fire stood up easily, showing none of the expected ill effects of the wounds that he had displayed the night before. He stood, holding the pot by the handle in one hand, while he balanced the wooden spoon with a steaming sample in the other. The aroma filled the room, and the guardian moved toward the table. Naria still watched him cautiously as he began spooning the cooked concoction into the bowls. "Please, sit," he said, pointing to the chair with the spoon. Naria moved hesitantly to the chair and sat down. She watched every move he made. The spicy, warm smell of the food was almost more than she could bear at this point. Naria quickly reached for the spoon next to the bowl, but then hesitated again before beginning to eat. The guardian sensed her distrust and set out to make her feel at ease. He reached into the bowl before her with his own spoon and ate a mouthful of its contents. Then he gently pushed the bowl back towards her. "The food will not harm you. It may be hot, but it is not lethal," he said with a smile that revealed white teeth that stood out against the bronze hue of his skin. His smile was disarming. Naria's hunger got the better of her, and she took up the spoon and began to eat. She was quite surprised by the dish. The complex mixture of taste and texture delighted all of her senses. Naria was so intent on quelling her rumbling stomach, she forgot to keep watch on the guardian sitting across from her, eating from a bowl as well. He was more intent on watching her eat than eating himself. She suddenly became aware of his intent gaze, stopped eating, and looked up at him. "This is quite delicious. Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. "In the order, we learn a lot of things, one of which I chose to learn was the art of cooking." "What about your wounds?" she said. "I thought you would have perhaps died in the night. They were quite severe." She blushed and nodded towards the general direction of his torso. He shrugged his wide shoulders and continued to chew in a thoughtful manner. "My people are also known for their quick, healing qualities," he said noncommittally. They continued to eat in silence, each watching the other over spoonfuls of food as the sun crept to its early and mid-morning position. Friends, that concludes chapters 1 through 5 of Richard Morgan's short novel, short story, or novella, Naria. In the next episode, I'll read aloud from chapters 6 through 10, and we'll close out the story of Naria on her adventure with an unknown baby and as yet unnamed guardian, still looking for her missing husband, Kalsh.